Hi everyone, Dr. Hill here. I wanted to talk about a nutrient today, B12, that we commonly see deficient here in the practice. I wanted to give you some of the rationale behind why we're seeing these deficiencies so common, and also give you some ideas about should you be thinking about B12 deficiency, what are some of the symptoms associated with that, and why those symptoms come on. So first let's talk about the deficiencies and why we end up with the deficiencies in B12 and why they're so prevalent. So the first thing we're going to look at here are going to be medications. So some of these medications that we're thinking about here are going to be things like your medications to help balance blood glucose levels. So things like your metformin or glucophage, that's going to be one category. Another pretty common category we see B12 deficiencies with that are associated with medications are going to be with your hormone replacements and definitely things like your birth control pills too. And really the reason there is that it's going to take more B12 levels to help metabolize and break those hormones down in the body. The next category of medications here that are going to be associated with deficiency are going to be your antacids. These antacids, this is really both over-the-counter and your prescription ones here. So really what's happening here is that you're decreasing the level of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and that decreased level of acid inhibits the breakdown or the break off of the of B12 from your protein sources, which leads us into our next category here, which is going to be a low protein diet. So those individuals that are consuming mostly a plant-based diet, nothing wrong with that. Definitely recommend consuming a plant-based diet. However, you've got to have some protein sources in there as well. And really it's important to have protein sources that are animal in nature, because that's really where you're going to find the highest quantity of B12 from a dietary standpoint. So low protein diets, thinking more along the lines of your vegan, vegetarian type diets, those are going to be the ones that are going to be at higher risk for this. But again, it's not that a vegetarian or vegan or model of diet is bad, it's just that there needs to be some protein sources in the diet as well. The next category here is going to be altered intestinal function, and there's a number of things that can contribute to this, but I'll focus on two here for the moment. The first one is going to be the consumption of foods that cause an increased inflammatory response in the intestinal tract, specifically in the small intestine, since that's where we're going to influence the absorption of B12 at. With the foods, gluten is the one. Gluten-containing foods are by far the category that we know probably has the most impact on this area. You can kind of take that into a more broad category and say grains as a whole, because they kind of across the board tend to have these types of effects. And then also you can see this with what's known as dysbiosis, or abnormal microorganisms in the gut. So maybe having something like a bacterial infection in there, or parasites, which are actually more common than you would expect. Those types of things will also influence the levels of B12 and promote a deficiency state by inhibiting absorption. Consumption of alcohol. Alcohol has a very similar effect. What alcohol is going to do is alcohol is actually going to alter the intestinal lining as well. So you inhibit some absorption there. And alcohol also acts as a diuretic, and since B12 is a water-soluble vitamin, you're potentially looking at increased excretion of B12 levels for that reason also. Aging. I generally don't like to throw aging in as a rationale for why something's happening, but at least in this consideration it should be considered, because what we know is that as you age, your levels of hydrochloric acid start to decline, your production becomes less efficient. And then just reduced absorption in general, and there's a couple of reasons for this. And one of the ones that I'll kind of link in here, and I'll just kind of put a side note in here and say stress. The reason that stress becomes important here is that when your body is under that stress state, essentially what's happening here is that you're reducing your body's ability to produce some of these secretions from the stomach, from the intestines, that actually help you absorb your B12. So stress can be a factor here. Another pretty pronounced rationale for why you're going to see reduced levels of absorption of B12 is going to be because of pernicious anemia. This is actually where the immune system has begun to attack the cells in the stomach, and it inhibits those cells from producing what's known as intrinsic factor to help absorb B12. So that can actually be tied back up into altered intestinal function also. So those are going to be a lot of your main causes there. The key thing for you to know is what symptoms are associated with this. So that kind of puts you on alert to let you know that you might want to think about doing something about these levels of B12, or at least at a minimum have your levels assessed. So let's start off here, and we can look at anemia. And anemias are not uncommon. When you think about them from a functional standpoint, they're actually fairly common. And what we mean by that is that it may not show up that you have an outright anemia on a test, but it also may show that if you look in a little more detail on those tests, that those numbers aren't really in what's considered an ideal state. So if we think about that, there may be a good indication there that you have an anemia. Now, when we think about anemias, a lot of times you'll think about iron being associated with that, and iron deficiency anemias are definitely prevalent. However, there are also other types of anemia of which a B12 and or folate deficiency it can also create an anemic state. With anemias, you're going to look at fatigue. So this is going to be one of the main complaints associated with that. It's certainly not the only complaint, but fatigue would be one of the symptoms. So if you're having fatigue, if you're seeing a decline in your energy apart from what you recognize as being ideal for you, certainly you're going to want to think about doing some type of assessment to figure out what's the cause of that. Numbness and tingling. These can be associated with B12 deficiencies also. And essentially what's happening here is that you're getting a change in the structure of the fatty tissue around the nerves. So that's going to alter the way that those nerves begin to sense numbness and tingling. We typically refer to that as a peripheral neuropathy. But numbness and tingling is how you'll think about that. Slower healing. So if you've begun to recognize that, let's say you injure your arm and it takes a little bit longer for you to heal than what you would consider to be ideal for you, or you notice that the healing time has gotten a little longer as you age, maybe it's not just a result of the aging process. Maybe it has to do with the fact that you don't have enough B12 to help replicate damaged tissue as rapidly as you need to. Essentially what's happening here is that for your body to replicate any type of new tissue, you've got to have B12 and folate available to make that happen. Neurotransmitter imbalances. There is a lot of utilization out there of medications to help alter neurological function or neuropsychiatric function. There's actually some pretty good evidence out there in the medical literature now showing that just when you use a B12 and or folate, that you can see some improvement in neurotransmitter function and neurological and neurochemical balancing just by the implementation of those nutrients. Impaired detoxification. So if you think about, we live in a relatively toxic world. When you begin to think about the effects of B12 here, B12 is actually, when you're talking about liver function specifically here for the moment, when you're talking about liver function, B12 is a necessary component to help run some of the cycles in liver function that ultimately end up helping us break down and eliminate some of the toxins that we're exposed to fairly routinely. So that's important. And then probably one of the ones that you definitely want to know about here is going to be an increase in homocysteine. If that marker or that name is unfamiliar to you, homocysteine is a chemical that you produce in your body. And essentially what we want some of it around, but we don't want these levels to become too hot. And the reason that we're concerned about that is that when we see homocysteine levels get a little bit too hot, what we're looking at is you run into such things as changes in cardiovascular tissue, negative changes in cardiovascular tissue, so damaging to the lining of the blood vessels here. You can see changes in cartilaginous tissue, so thinking about your joints, damaging the joints, altered neurological function, so potentially damaging some of your neurological tissue here. And even looking at things such as osteoporosis, there's some correlations between an increase in homocysteine and increase in osteoporosis. So these are some of the symptoms that you would begin to think about with this. Now, something I want to leave you with when you're thinking about correcting these, one of the questions I often get is, well, do I need to do B12 injections? Nothing wrong with doing a B12 injection. Certainly a lot of validity to them. You can glean a lot of benefit from doing a B12 injection, but it's definitely not the only way that you can see an improvement in your B12 levels. Oral utilization of B12 for a lot of individuals, according to both my clinical experience and medical literature, is certainly a sufficient way to replete B12 levels. The big consideration here becomes, what are or how much exposure does an individual have to some of these things that we talked about that might create a deficiency, and would, for example, a reduced absorption, well, if you're using an oral form and you have a reduced absorptive state, then you probably do need to look at alternative methods there. Some of the ones that work fairly well are the injections, but there's other ones in that, because as we know, getting stuck with a needle is not the most ideal thing to do on a day-to-day basis. So some of your other options here are going to be things like sublinguals. Those work pretty good, and also newer out is the transdermal. So actually application of a transdermal to help get B12 and or folate across the skin and into the blood to be utilized without having to worry about taking it orally. So there are other options out there for you if you're not a fan of the injections getting stuck fairly frequently. But something to think about here, again, this is one of the more common deficiencies that I see. So it's certainly something that I wanted you to know about and kind of have a little bit of background so you could think about it if you're running into any of these symptoms that we've noted down here. So hope this helps you out. Good health.